On the morning of January 22, 1973, the atmospheric pressure over Athens hovered at a stable 1014 hectopascals, providing a deceptive sense of calm. At the Hellinikon International Airport, a facility originally constructed as a Nazi Luftwaffe base during the occupation, the air carried a sharp, crystalline chill. Aristotle Onassis stood on the periphery of the runway, his silhouette framed by the distant shimmering masts of the Marina Zeus. He was a man who possessed a net worth of $500 million in 1973, a sum that, when adjusted for the inflation and purchasing power of 2026, represents a staggering $3.58 billion. He was the sovereign of the seas, yet he was about to lose the only territory that mattered, his lineage. The instrument of this destruction was a Piaggio P136L2, an Italian-made twin-engine amphibious gull-wing aircraft. This specific machine was a marvel of post-war engineering, powered by two Lycoming GSO 480 engines producing 340 horsepower each. It was designed for luxury and versatility, capable of landing on both concrete and salt water. At exactly 3:15 p.m., Alexander Onassis, the 24-year-old heir to the Olympic Airways empire, climbed into the cockpit. The technical reality of the flight was compromised before the engines even turned. Just days prior, the aileron cables had been replaced during a routine maintenance overhaul. In a fatal engineering oversight, the connecting rods had been reversed. This meant that when Alexander moved the control column to the left to counteract a gust, the plane would violently bank to the right. As the Piaggio accelerated down runway 15L, the roar of the Lycoming engines reached a mechanical crescendo of 2,800 RPM. Within seconds of breaking ground, the aircraft pitched into a lethal roll. The physics were absolute. The more Alexander fought the controls, the faster the plane drove itself into the tarmac. The impact was a chaotic symphony of tearing duralumin and igniting 100-octane aviation fuel. The fuselage crumpled like tinfoil, trapping the air in a cage of hot, jagged metal. Aristotle Onassis watched as the future of his dynasty was reduced to a plume of black, acrid smoke rising against the Aegean blue. The medical aftermath was a cold descent into neurological hopelessness. Alexander was rushed to the KT hospital in Kifisia, a trauma center specializing in spinal and cranial injuries. The surgeons encountered a type 3 open cranial fracture with massive cerebral edema. In the waiting room, Onassis was no longer a tycoon. He was a desperate customer trying to bribe God. He flew in the world's leading neurosurgeons from London and Boston on private jets, paying fees that would exceed $150,000 per day in today's currency. They arrived only to confirm the inevitable. The brain was dead. The machines kept the heart beating, a rhythmic artificial sound that mocked the silence of the father. In the macroeconomic context of 1973, the world was on the precipice of the first great oil shock. The OPEC nations were preparing to squeeze the West, a move that would eventually make Onassis even richer as the demand for his massive tankers skyrocketed. Yet as he sat in that sterile hospital corridor, the global movement of crude oil meant nothing. He was surrounded by his daughter, Christina, and his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The tension between the two women was palpable, a silent war of resentment. Christina blamed Jackie's Kennedy curse for the crash. Jackie, ever the stoic widow, maintained a mask of frozen elegance. Even the $2 million life insurance policy on Alexander, roughly $14.3 million in 2026, felt like a grotesque insult to the man who had built a kingdom specifically for the boy, now lying on a rubber sheet. At 7 p.m. on January 23rd, Aristotle gave the order to disconnect the life support. The silence that followed was heavier than the steel hulls of his fleet. He walked out of the hospital into a swarm of flashbulbs, his eyes hidden behind his signature thick-rimmed glasses. He had reached the summit of human greed, only to find the air there was unbreathable. He began to suspect that his life was not a series of triumphs, but a meticulously constructed trap. To understand the architect of this ruin, one must look past the billionaire and find the boy who stood amidst the cinders of a burning world, learning that fire is the only true witness to history. The fire that forged him did not start in a boardroom, but in a city that no longer exists on any map. In September 1922, the cosmopolitan port of Smyrna was the jewel of the Levant, a Mediterranean metropolis where French, Greek, Armenian, and Turkish cultures collided in a wealthy, chaotic sprawl. Aristotle Onassis was 17, the son of Socrates Onassis, a tobacco merchant whose warehouses held the finest basma and Izmir leaf in the region. The family's wealth was significant, localized but potent, allowing them to live in a villa staffed by servants. But the geopolitical tectonic plates were shifting. The Greco-Turkish War was reaching its bloody climax. As the Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk entered the city, the atmosphere turned from apprehension to absolute terror. The Great Fire of Smyrna began on September 13th. It was a technical catastrophe of thermal radiation and urban planning. The city's narrow streets acted as chimneys, drawing the heat upward and creating a firestorm that reached temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Celsius. Aristotle watched from the quay as the wooden balconies of the European quarter ignited spontaneously. The scent of burning cedar and expensive upholstery was choked out by the stench of scorched tobacco from his father's warehouses. Millions of drachmas in inventory, equivalent to roughly $12 million in 2026 purchasing power, evaporated in a single afternoon. His father, Socrates, was arrested by the Turkish authorities, accused of conspiring with the Greek administration. Aristotle, displaying the ruthless pragmatism that would later define his business career, did not succumb to panic. He utilized his youth and a forged Nansen passport to navigate the Turkish lines. He spent the few gold coins he had hidden in his boots to bribe guards, learning that every man, regardless of his ideology, has a price that can be calculated in weight. He managed to secure his father's release, but the family was broken. They were refugees, part of the 1.5 million Greeks expelled from Asia Minor. In 1923, Aristotle boarded a ship for Buenos Aires with $250 in his pocket, approximately $4,600 today. Argentina in the 1920s was the land of the future, a country with a GDP per capita that rivaled Germany and France. Onassis arrived at the port of Buenos Aires, a labyrinth of Beaux-Arts architecture and sprawling cattle docks. He took a job as a night plugger for the United River Plate Telephone Company. The work was monotonous but strategically vital. Working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, he sat before a Western Electric manual switchboard, a wall of brass jacks and fabric-covered cords. This was his true education. By eavesdropping on the late-night international calls of grain speculators and shipping magnates, he mapped the nervous system of global commerce. He learned who was desperate for credit, which harvests had failed in the Ukraine, and which ships were sitting idle in the Rio de la Plata. In 1925, he moved into the tobacco trade, applying the technical knowledge of Oriental leaf he had inherited from his father. The Argentine market was dominated by harsh, dark tobacco. Onassis realized that the growing middle class and the rising new woman of the Roaring Twenties wanted something smoother, the mild, sun-cured Turkish leaf of his youth. He contacted his father in Greece and arranged for the first shipment of 10,000 pounds of high-grade tobacco. He marketed his cigarettes, Osman and Primeros, with an aggressive, modern aesthetic. He realized that a product's value was 30% chemistry and 70% mythology. By the age of 25, his bank account held $1 million, a sum that in 2026 would command the influence of over $18 million. He was no longer a refugee, he was a financier. He had mastered the art of triangular trade, moving goods between South America, Europe, and the Middle East, while keeping his capital in constant motion to avoid the volatility of the Argentine peso. He began to cultivate an image of a refined playboy, wearing tailored suits and frequenting the Colón Theater, yet his eyes remained those of the boy on the Smyrna quay. He knew that physical assets, buildings, warehouses, villas, could be burned. Only the sea offered a platform for a wealth that could not be touched by fire or borders. He looked toward the horizon, at the rusty hulls of the grain ships leaving Buenos Aires, and saw not just vessels, but floating sovereign states. He was ready to buy his first ghost. But the ships he sought were not built for luxury. They were the scavenged remains of a world that had forgotten how to dream. By 1932, the global economy was a landscape of structural failure. The Great Depression had reduced world trade by 60%, and the shipping industry was its most visible corpse. In the fjords of Norway and the inlets of the St. Lawrence River, thousands of vessels sat idle, their hulls accumulating barnacles and rust, their boilers cold. While the established maritime dynasties of London and Piraeus retreated into liquidating assets to cover debt, Aristotle Onassis looked at the wreckage and saw a mathematical certainty of recovery. He traveled to Ottawa, Canada, where the Canadian National Railways was desperate to offload 6 freighter ships that had become a fiscal hemorrhage. Onassis purchased them for $120,000, a sum that in 2026 represents approximately $2.85 million. At the time, the scrap value of the steel alone nearly covered the investment. This was the birth of his ghost fleet. The technical specifications of these vessels were unremarkable but robust. They were 8,000-ton tramp steamers, powered by triple expansion steam engines and coal-fired Scotch boilers. These engines were masterpieces of 19th century thermodynamics, utilizing 3 cylinders of increasing diameter to extract every possible joule of energy from the steam. However, they were labor-intensive and expensive to run under traditional maritime laws. Onassis understood that to make these trash cans profitable, he had to bypass the high-cost labor unions of the West. He became one of the first to exploit the flag of convenience system. By registering his ships in Panama, he circumvented the stringent safety regulations and wage floors of the United States and Great Britain. In Panama, the 1925 labor code was virtually non-existent for foreign-owned vessels, allowing Onassis to staff his ships with low-wage crews from Asia and the Mediterranean, operating at 40% less cost than his competitors. The macroeconomic context of the early 1930s favored the bold and the unattached. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act had choked international commerce, but the demand for raw materials, grain, coal, and increasingly oil, could not be entirely suppressed. Onassis placed his trusted associate, Kostas Gratsos, in charge of technical operations. Gratsos was a graduate of the London School of Economics and possessed a granular understanding of maritime insurance. Together, they navigated the complex requirements of Lloyd's of London. In 1932, a basic hull and machinery policy for a tramp steamer cost roughly $5,000 per year, $118,000 in 2026. But Onassis used his Argentine connections to secure captive insurance models that reduced his premiums. He was not just moving cargo. He was moving risk. As he consolidated his fleet, he began to observe a shift in global energy. The transition from coal-fired engines to oil-burning internal combustion was accelerating. In 1934, the world's tanker fleet was still in its infancy, dominated by the major oil companies like Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell. Onassis realized that if he built his own tankers, he could lease them back to these giants, essentially making the Seven Sisters pay for his expansion. This strategy required a level of capital he did not yet possess, leading him to the doors of the National City Bank of New York. He presented a persona of absolute stability, despite the fact that his ships were often one storm away from sinking. He was a master of creative accounting, utilizing the blurred lines between his Greek heritage, his Argentine citizenship, and his Panamanian registrations to create a jurisdictional fog that tax authorities could not penetrate. The archive curiosities of the 1930s shipping world reveal the brutal reality of this era. A sailor on an Onassis ship earned roughly $30 a month, $710 in 2026, living in cramped, unventilated quarters where the temperature often exceeded 45 degrees Celsius near the engine room. Communication was conducted via high-frequency maritime radio telegraphy, where every word cost the equivalent of $5 in today's money. Onassis would send coded messages to his captains to save costs, a primitive precursor to the encrypted data streams of modern logistics. He lived in a suite at the Savoy in London or the Plaza in New York, a stark contrast to the grease-stained decks of his fleet. He was constructing a machine that converted human sweat and cheap steel into a global power base, but the machine was about to be tested by the largest industrial mobilization in human history. As the shadow of the Second World War lengthened over Europe, the value of a ship changed from a business asset to a strategic necessity. Onassis knew that in a world at war, the man who controls the transport of fuel controls the outcome of the conflict. He also knew that the United States government was watching every move he made, waiting for a single slip in his complex web of offshore corporations. Post-1945, the world was a reconstruction site fueled by the Marshall Plan and an insatiable thirst for petroleum. Aristotle Onassis entered the 1950s with a financial formula that would revolutionize global capitalism. Other people's money, OPM. His strategy was a masterpiece of fiduciary engineering. He would secure a long-term time charter from an oil giant like Saucony Vacuum, now ExxonMobil, to transport crude for 10 or 15 years. Using that contract as collateral, he would convince American banks to lend him 100% of the construction costs for a new tanker. The bank held the mortgage, the oil company provided the revenue, and Onassis kept the profit and the ownership. He was building a multi-billion-dollar empire without spending a single cent of his own capital. In 2026 terms, he was leveraging debt into a personal fortune of billions with the surgical precision of a hedge fund manager. The technical vanguard of this expansion was the supertanker. In 1953, he launched the Tina Onassis at the Howaldswerke shipyard in Hamburg, Germany. At 45,000 deadweight tons, DWT, it was the largest tanker in the world. The engineering was a radical departure from the riveted hulls of the war era. The Tina Onassis utilized advanced submerged arc welding techniques, which reduced the ship's weight and increased its structural integrity. The vessel was powered by a 17,500 shaft horsepower steam turbine, allowing it to maintain a cruising speed of 17 knots even when fully laden. The interior was finished with the luxury of an ocean liner, featuring air-conditioned quarters, a rarity for the time, and a mahogany-paneled owner's suite. The cost of construction was approximately $6 million in 1953, which scales to over $71 million in 2026. However, this rapid ascent drew the predatory gaze of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. The legal conflict centered on the Surplus Property Act and the Shipping Act of 1916. Under these laws, surplus American war vessels, such as the T-2 tankers and Liberty ships, could only be purchased by American citizens. Onassis had utilized a complex shell game, creating American-registered companies where he held the majority of the profit, but ostensibly gave voting control to American puppets. In 1954, the U.S. Department of Justice struck back. They indicted Onassis and his associates for conspiracy to defraud the United States. The FBI surveillance files from this period reveal a man under constant pressure, his phones tapped and his movements tracked by agents who viewed him as a foreign parasite on American industry. The macro-political environment of the Cold War added a layer of paranoia to the proceedings. The U.S. government feared that a stateless Greek tycoon could, in a moment of crisis, divert the flow of oil to the Soviet bloc. Onassis's rival, Stavros Niarchos, his brother-in-law and bitter competitor, was simultaneously playing the same game, often feeding information to the authorities to sabotage Onassis. This was a war of the Golden Greeks. In February 1954, while Onassis was in Washington, D.C. to defend his interests, he was arrested. The image of the billionaire being fingerprinted and photographed like a common criminal flashed across the global wires. He was facing a potential prison sentence and the confiscation of his entire U.S.-flagged fleet. Onassis did not panic. He negotiated from a position of industrial strength. He knew the U.S. needed his tankers to maintain the energy security of the NATO alliance. After months of legal maneuvering, he reached a settlement in 1955. He agreed to pay a fine of $7 million, roughly $82 million in 2026, and pledged to build a new fleet of supertankers in American shipyards using American labor. It was a tactical retreat that resulted in a strategic victory. By paying the fine, he laundered his reputation and gained the legal right to operate within the American system. He was now untouchable, a sovereign entity with more naval displacement than many sovereign nations. Secondary characters in this drama included his wife, Tina Livanos, the daughter of Stavros Livanos, the patriarch of Greek shipping. Their marriage was a merger of two of the most powerful maritime houses in history, yet it was a cold, transactional union. While Tina curated their social standing in New York and Paris, Onassis was obsessed with the minute details of ship maintenance and fuel consumption. He would review the boiler logs of his ships personally, looking for any inefficiency. He understood that in the high-stakes world of the 1950s, a 1% increase in engine efficiency across a fleet of 50 ships translated to millions of dollars in annual profit. He had engineered a leviathan that moved the world's energy, but as he stood at the apex of his technical and financial powers, he began to realize that a king without a court is merely a target. With the American government temporarily appeased, Onassis turned his attention toward the Mediterranean, seeking a trophy that would signify his ultimate triumph over the old world's aristocracy. In 1954, Aristotle Onassis achieved a feat of naval engineering and social audacity that redefined the concept of the private vessel. He purchased the HMCS Stormont, a surplus Canadian River-class frigate that had served as a convoy escort during the Battle of the Atlantic. The purchase price was a mere $34,000, but the subsequent conversion at the Havelswerke shipyard in Kiel, West Germany, cost over $4 million, a sum that in 2026 purchasing power exceeds $47.5 million. This was not a mere renovation. It was a total structural metamorphosis. The frigate's 300-foot steel hull was stripped to the waterline and rebuilt using high-tensile naval steel and expansive teak decking. The original twin-shaft reciprocating steam engines were replaced with more efficient, though still thunderous, power plants, allowing the vessel, now renamed the Christina O, to cruise at 18 knots. Onassis didn't just want a yacht. He wanted a mobile, sovereign territory that outperformed the luxury of the Waldorf Astoria while maintaining the rugged durability of a warship. The technical specifications of the Christina O were unparalleled for the mid-20th century. The yacht featured an early form of marine air conditioning and a complex internal telephone system that allowed Onassis to manage his global fleet from the middle of the Aegean. The most famous engineering marvel was the swimming pool located on the main deck. It featured a floor of intricate Minoan-style mosaics depicting a bull leaper from the Palace of Knossos. At the touch of a hydraulic switch, the pool floor would rise to become a dance floor, a feat of fluid mechanics that required precise counterweights to prevent the water from destabilizing the ship's center of gravity during the transition. The vessel's interior was a museum of excess. The handrails were crafted from solid silver, and the Ares bar was famously upholstered with the skin of whale prepuces, a detail Onassis relished explaining to his female guests with a predatory smirk. The walls displayed original works by Renoir, Pissarro, and El Greco, secured with custom-engineered vibration-dampening mounts to protect the canvases from the ship's engine tremors and salt air corrosion. The macroeconomic climate of 1954 provided the backdrop for this extravagance. Post-war Europe was stabilizing, and the jet set was emerging. Onassis understood that in the high-stakes world of international commerce, the environment in which a deal is signed is as important as the terms. The Christina O became the ultimate soft power tool. The annual operating budget of the yacht was roughly $500,000 in 1950s currency, equivalent to nearly $6 million today. This included a permanent crew of 35, ranging from German stewards to Swedish massage therapists. The kitchen was stocked with the finest ingredients flown in from Paris and Rome: Petrosian caviar, Kobe beef, and vintage Krug champagne. By hosting figures like Winston Churchill, Greta Garbo, and the Begum Habibe Aga Khan, Onassis was not just entertaining. He was insulating himself within a fortress of celebrity and political influence. Churchill in particular spent 8 cruises aboard the vessel, his presence providing Onassis with an implicit stamp of British imperial legitimacy that no amount of money could directly buy. The archive curiosities of the yacht reveal a man obsessed with control. Onassis insisted on a specific protocol for every guest. Churchill was assigned the Ithaca Suite, which was equipped with a custom-built desk and a reinforced chair to accommodate his weight. The yacht's laundry system was industrial grade, capable of processing hundreds of silk sheets and linen napkins daily to maintain the illusion of effortless perfection. Yet beneath the veneer of baccarat crystal and lapis lazuli fireplaces, the Christina O was a cage. Onassis's children, Alexander and Christina, spent their formative years in this artificial environment, surrounded by servants and their father's rotating cast of mistresses. They were the golden orphans of the Mediterranean, living in a world where the price of everything was known, but the value of a stable home was non-existent. In 1956, the Suez Crisis would momentarily threaten the shipping lanes, but for Onassis, it was another opportunity for expansion. He watched the geopolitical map from the bridge of his yacht, his radar scanning for more than just physical obstacles. He was looking for the one element missing from his collection, a woman whose fame was as global and as tragic as his own ambition. The Christina O was the stage, and the world was about to witness a performance of calculated seduction and public humiliation that would destroy a legend. Among the shifting roster of elites, one voice began to resonate louder than the ship's engines, a voice that Onassis decided he must own, not for its beauty, but for the status it conferred upon the man who could silence it. In 1957, Aristotle Onassis was legally bound to Tina Livanos, the daughter of the shipping magnate Stavros Livanos. This marriage was a technical merger of 2 of the world's most powerful maritime balance sheets, consolidating a fleet that controlled a significant percentage of global crude transport. However, at a masked ball in Venice, hosted by the socialite Elsa Maxwell, Onassis met Maria Callas, the La Divina of the opera world. Callas was at the absolute zenith of her technical prowess. She had recently undergone a dramatic physical transformation, losing over 60 pounds to achieve a svelte, high-fashion aesthetic that matched her vocal intensity. She was married to Giovanni Battista Meneghini, an older Italian industrialist who managed her career with stultifying precision. To Onassis, Callas was the ultimate acquisition. She was the most famous woman in the world, an artist who commanded the respect of the European intelligentsia, a class that still viewed Onassis as a vulgar parvenu. The seduction of Callas was an exercise in overwhelming logistical force. Onassis invited the Meneghinis aboard the Christina O for a cruise in 1959. In the macro-political context of the late 1950s, the world was obsessed with the affair of the century. The cruise was a psychological battlefield. Onassis utilized his wealth to make Meneghini appear small and provincial. While the yacht sailed through the Dardanelles, Onassis and Callas conducted a blatant affair under the noses of their respective spouses. The cost of this seduction was more than financial. It was a destruction of reputations. When the cruise ended, Callas walked away from her marriage and her career for Onassis. She believed she had found a partner of equal stature. She did not realize she had merely been added to the inventory of a man who viewed human beings as depreciating assets. Technically, the decline of Maria Callas can be traced to this period. The stress of the public scandal, combined with the extreme weight loss and Onassis's lack of support for her art, began to affect her vocal cords. Opera critics noted a growing wobble in her high register and a loss of breath support. Onassis, who had no ear for opera and notoriously fell asleep during her performances, pressured her to abandon the stage. He wanted the celebrity, not the work. He demanded she be available for his whims, effectively turning the world's greatest soprano into a social ornament. Behind the closed doors of the Christina O and his Paris apartment at 88 Avenue Foch, a property worth approximately $35 million in 2026, the relationship was toxic. Onassis frequently humiliated Callas in front of guests, mocking her intelligence and her devotion. He once told her, You are nothing. You just have a whistle in your throat that no longer works. Secondary characters in this drama, like the gossip columnist Dorothy Kilgallen, fueled the global frenzy. The public's appetite for the Greek tycoon and his diva was insatiable, reflecting a 1960s culture that was pivoting from post-war austerity to a voyeuristic obsession with the ultra-rich. For Onassis, the affair with Callas was a smokescreen for his ongoing business wars. While the world watched his romantic entanglements, he was navigating the complexities of the 1960 oil glut and the rising influence of the Soviet merchant marine. He used Callas to distract the press from his secret negotiations with the Saudi royal family and his attempts to monopolize the transport of Arabian oil, a move that nearly resulted in a covert intervention by the CIA. In 1966, rumor and archive fragments suggest Callas became pregnant with Onassis's child. According to her biographer and close associates, Onassis forced her to undergo an abortion, fearing that a new heir would complicate his existing estate and the inheritance of Alexander and Christina. The child, allegedly named Omero, was born prematurely and died hours later. This event shattered the last of Callas's emotional defenses. She remained loyal to Onassis, even as he began to distance himself from her. She had sacrificed her voice, her marriage, and her child for a man who was already looking for a more prestigious trophy. The social mask of the glamorous Mediterranean couple was crumbling, revealing a core of profound cruelty. Onassis had conquered the world of shipping and the world of high art, but he still felt the sting of exclusion from the true centers of political power. He began to track a new target, one that would provide him with the ultimate revenge against the American establishment that had once fingerprinted him like a criminal. He watched the news from Washington with the cold calculation of a predator, waiting for a tragedy that would leave a vacuum he was more than willing to fill with gold. The stage was set for a heist of history, where the prize was not a soprano, but the grieving widow of an American king. In July 1956, the geopolitical architecture of the Middle East underwent a seismic shift that would inadvertently solidify Aristotle Onassis as the undisputed sovereign of the seas. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal, seizing control from the British and French interests that had managed the waterway since its inception. This was a direct response to the withdrawal of funding for the Aswan High Dam. On October 29th, the situation escalated into a full-scale military conflict involving Israel, the United Kingdom, and France. The canal, a 120-mile technical marvel of civil engineering that facilitated 15% of world trade, was blocked by scuttled ships. For the global economy, this was a catastrophe. For the logistical machine of Aristotle Onassis, it was the ultimate windfall. The technical reality of the canal blockage meant that the primary artery for Middle Eastern crude oil to reach Europe was severed. The standard route from the Persian Gulf to London via Suez was approximately 6,400 nautical miles. Without the canal, tankers were forced to navigate the Cape of Good Hope, a grueling 11,300-mile journey. Most of the world's tanker fleet at the time consisted of T2-type vessels, which lacked the fuel capacity and structural integrity for such a detour. However, Onassis had spent the previous 5 years building supertankers like the Tina Onassis and the Al-Malik Saud Al-Awal. These vessels possessed the deadweight tonnage, upwards of 45,000 DWT, and the specialized propulsion systems required to make the Cape route profitable. While his competitors' ships sat idle or struggled with the logistics of refueling, Onassis's fleet became the only viable bridge for the world's energy needs. The financial metrics of 1956 were staggering. Before the crisis, the spot rate for transporting oil from the Gulf to Europe was roughly $4 per ton. Within weeks of the blockage, Onassis drove the price up to over $60 per ton. A single voyage of a 40,000-ton tanker could generate a gross profit of $2 million. A sum that in 2026 purchasing power represents an astounding $23.4 million. Since a round trip took approximately 60 days, Onassis was generating wealth at a rate of nearly $400,000 per day in modern currency per vessel. He reportedly net a profit of over $70 million during the crisis. which translates to a $820 million injection into his liquid assets in 2026 terms. He used this capital to diversify his empire, venturing into the aviation sector by founding Olympic Airways in 1957. He leased the rights from the Greek state for $2 million, $21 million today, effectively gaining a monopoly over the nation's airspace. Macro-politically, the Suez Crisis signaled the end of British imperial influence and the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as the dominant brokers of the Middle East. Onassis, operating outside the constraints of any single nation's tax code or labor laws, functioned as a third-party superpower. In 1963, he purchased the island of Scorpios for 5 million drachmas, approximately $110,000 at the time, or roughly $1.1 million in 2026. However, the technical development of the island was an engineering feat that cost tens of millions. He imported thousands of tons of topsoil, planted over 200,000 trees including lemons and oranges from around the Mediterranean, and constructed a sophisticated desalination plant to provide fresh water to a rock that had previously been barren. He built a private harbor capable of docking the Christina O, ensuring that his sovereign territory was as functional as it was isolated. Secondary figures in this era, such as the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, watched Onassis's autonomy with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. The Greek Tycoon was one of the few Western-aligned individuals who could negotiate with Moscow to transport Soviet oil when the Western majors boycotted them. This ability to traverse the Iron Curtain was not based on ideology, but on a cold, technical understanding of supply chains. Archive records show that Onassis maintained a rigorous schedule, often sleeping only 4 hours a night, spending his waking hours reviewing the daily telex reports, a primitive but effective form of digital communication that used 5-bit Baudot code to transmit data across oceans. He was a man who understood that in a world divided by walls and canals, the one who owns the path around them owns the world itself. Yet as the 1960s progressed, the thrill of the Suez jackpot began to fade into a restless search for a different kind of power. He had mastered the flow of oil and the movement of airplanes, but he remained a pariah in the eyes of the Anglo-American establishment. He needed a bridge into the heart of the American myth, a way to permanently integrate himself into the history books of the West. He turned his gaze toward a grieving woman in Washington, realizing that his greatest acquisition was not a fleet, but a widow. On October 20th, 1968, the rain fell steadily over the island of Scorpios as Jacqueline Lee Bouvier Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis. The event was a technical and logistical nightmare for the international press, which found itself barred from the private island by a security force that Onassis had equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance and small arms. To the American public, the marriage was a profanation. The Queen of Camelot choosing a pirate 5 years after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. To Onassis, it was the ultimate insurance policy. He was not just marrying a woman, he was acquiring the protective aura of the Kennedy dynasty, a move intended to insulate his global business interests from any future legal incursions by the United States government. The marriage was predicated on a legal document of extraordinary complexity, a 171-clause prenuptial agreement. This contract, drafted by a phalanx of attorneys in New York and Athens, was a masterpiece of asset protection and transactional negotiation. It guaranteed Jackie an immediate payment of $3 million, approximately $27.4 million in 2026, plus an additional $1 million for each of her children, Caroline and John Jr., totaling $18.2 million today. Furthermore, it established a monthly allowance of $30,000 for her personal expenses, which in 2026 purchasing power exceeds $274,000 per month. The contract even specified the division of property in the event of death or divorce, detailing everything from the ownership of jewelry to the rights to reside in Onassis's various villas. It was a merger, not a romance, conducted with the cold technicality of a corporate takeover. The macro context of 1968 was one of global upheaval. The Vietnam War was at its peak. The civil rights movement was mourning Martin Luther King Jr., and only months before the wedding, Robert F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Los Angeles. Bobby Kennedy had been Onassis's most formidable enemy within the American establishment, famously blocking Aries' attempts to buy into the American shipping market and labeling him the most dangerous man in the world. With Bobby dead, the last barrier to Jackie was removed. Teddy Kennedy, the surviving brother, acted as the lead negotiator for the family, ensuring that the financial terms were favorable enough to secure Jackie's future in a world that had become increasingly hostile to her safety. The golden lifestyle of the new couple was a technical exhibition of hyperconsumption. Jackie's spending habits became a matter of global fascination and archival record. In her first year of marriage, she reportedly spent over $1.2 million on clothing and art, a sum that in 2026 would be nearly $11 million. She frequented the ateliers of Valentino and Givenchy, where a single custom-made gown cost upwards of $10,000, $91,000 today. Onassis encouraged this, viewing her expenditures as a form of marketing for his brand. However, the relationship was architecturally hollow. Onassis spent the majority of his time in his offices in Monte Carlo or aboard the Christina O, while Jackie preferred the social circles of New York and Martha's Vineyard. They were two icons who shared a bed occasionally, but their lives were separate orbits governed by the gravity of their own fame. Archive curiosities from this period reveal the etiquette of the Happy Jack era. When they were together, Onassis followed a strict protocol. He would fly in fresh bread from Paris to Scorpios every morning via a dedicated Olympic Airways flight, a logistical extravagance that cost thousands. He showered Jackie with jewelry from Harry Winston and Van Cleef & Arpels, including the famous 40.42 carat Lesotho third diamond, purchased for $600,000 in 1968, over $5.4 million today. Yet the social cost was high. The American elite, including Jackie's former social circle, largely shunned her, viewing the marriage as a betrayal of the fallen president. Onassis, in turn, grew frustrated by Jackie's indifference to his business world and her constant need for privacy, which conflicted with his desire for public display. By 1969, the Camelot heist had achieved its primary objective. Onassis was no longer a target for the U.S. Justice Department. His association with the Kennedys gave him a layer of social sovereign immunity. However, the marriage had also alienated the one person who truly mattered to his legacy, his son, Alexander. Alexander viewed Jackie as a black widow who would drain the family fortune. The tension between the heir and the stepmother was a corrosive force within the Onassis household, creating a fracture that no amount of gold could repair. Onassis had bought the world's most famous widow, but in doing so, he had awakened a sleeping resentment in his children that would lead to the eventual collapse of his dynasty. As the 1970s dawned, the Golden Greek was at the height of his social power, but the technical foundations of his personal life were beginning to show signs of structural fatigue. He had built a fortress of wealth and a palace of fame, but he had forgotten that every fortress has a flaw and every heist has a consequence. By the onset of the 1970s, the architectural integrity of the Onassis empire began to suffer from systemic fatigue. The global economic landscape was transitioning through the Nixon shock of 1971, which ended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold and terminated the Bretton Woods system. For a man whose wealth was anchored in fixed-term shipping contracts and international currency fluctuations, this created a volatile fiscal environment. Simultaneously, the technical burden of Olympic Airways had become a massive financial hemorrhage. By 1972, the airline was losing an estimated $1 million per week, a deficit that translates to roughly $7.4 million every 7 days in 2026. The fleet, consisting of Boeing 707-320Bs and the then revolutionary 747-200s, required immense capital for maintenance and aviation fuel, the prices of which were destabilized by the brewing tensions in the Middle East. Onassis found himself locked in a brutal legal war with the Greek military junta to nationalize the airline and offload his losses, a process that involved complex litigation over the right of reversion and state subsidies. However, the legal battles were secondary to the biological and psychological rot consuming his inner circle. The Onassis curse was no longer a tabloid headline. It was a clinical reality. His daughter, Christina, had descended into a cycle of severe clinical depression and chemical dependency. Archival medical records and testimonies from the era indicate her reliance on barbiturates and amphetamines to regulate her sleep and weight, spending upwards of $30,000 a month, $220,000 today, on private physicians and clandestine treatments. In 1970, Onassis's first wife, Tina Livanos, delivered a crushing technical blow to his ego by marrying his arch-rival, Stavros Niarchos. This was more than a romantic betrayal. It was a strategic realignment of the Livanos shipping fortune, which controlled a significant portion of the world's dry bulk tonnage. The merger of the Niarchos and Livanos interests created a maritime entity that rivaled Onassis in both deadweight capacity and political lobbying power. The tragedy deepened in October 1974 when Tina was found dead in her suite at the Hôtel de Chanelay in Paris. The technical cause of death was officially recorded as a pulmonary edema, but the presence of high concentrations of barbiturates in her system fueled rumors of suicide or foul play. The autopsy, a meticulous process conducted under the scrutiny of French authorities, became a centerpiece of global speculation. Onassis, who had never truly divested his emotional interest in Tina, despite his marriage to Jackie, was devastated. He began to view his wealth as a magnetic pole for tragedy. His paranoia reached a clinical zenith. He spent millions upgrading the security systems on Scorpios, installing underwater sensors and infrared perimeter cameras, technologies that were then in their infancy and cost the equivalent of $5 million in 2026. He was a man obsessed with the logistics of safety in a world where he no longer felt secure. The social fabric of his marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy was also in a state of advanced decomposition. Jackie spent most of her time at her apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue in New York, a 15-room duplex that required a staff of 6 and cost approximately $25,000 a month in maintenance, nearly $185,000 in today's currency. The communication between them was conducted through a series of cold, typewritten memos and telegrams. Onassis began to regret the 1968 prenuptial agreement, instructing his lawyers to find technical loopholes to reduce her inheritance. He hired private investigators to track her spending, documenting every invoice from luxury boutiques as evidence of her fiscal irresponsibility. He was preparing for a legal divorce that would have been the most expensive in history, a technical disassembling of the Camelot myth. As 1974 drew to a close, Onassis was no longer the vigorous golden Greek. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of his choices, surrounded by the cold steel of his tankas and the silent rooms of his villas. The geopolitical shift of the 1973 oil embargo had technically made him richer as the demand for long-haul transport surged, but he lacked the vitality to enjoy the profit. He had become a prisoner of his own success, trapped in a sovereign island of his own making, where the only thing he could hear was the ticking of a clock he could not stop. The structural failure of his empire was no longer a matter of if, but when. As his own body began to mirror the decline of his house, the man who had built a kingdom on the movement of oil was about to find that his own internal systems were failing, and no amount of wealth could repair the neurological connections of a dying king. By early 1975, Aristotle Onassis had transitioned from a global tycoon to a biological casualty. He was suffering from myasthenia gravis, an autoimmune neuromuscular disease characterized by varying degrees of skeletal muscle weakness. The technical pathology involves the body producing antibodies that block, alter, or destroy the receptors for acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, preventing muscle contraction. For Onassis, the most visible symptom was ptosis, the drooping of the upper eyelids. To maintain the illusion of sight and authority, the man who controlled 5% of the world's private shipping was reduced to using strips of leukoplast adhesive tape to physically pin his eyelids to his forehead. It was a grotesque, technical fix for a systemic collapse, a metaphor for his entire existence. He moved through the corridors of his home like a specter, his vision tunneled, and his muscles failing. He retreated to the island of Scorpios, which had become a $50 million fortress of isolation, equivalent to $360 million in 2026. The island's infrastructure was a marvel of private engineering, featuring its own power grid, a sophisticated radio telecommunications hub, and a desalination plant capable of producing 100,000 gallons of fresh water daily. Yet Onassis spent his nights wandering the olive groves in a state of near hallucination. He was frequently seen at the mausoleum he had built for his son Alexander, a structure of white pentelic marble that cost over $500,000, $3.7 million today. He would sit in the darkness, speaking to the tomb in Greek, attempting to negotiate with the dead for the one thing his money couldn't buy, a second chance for his lineage. He had become the ghost of Scorpios, a figure of pity for the few servants who remained on the island. Macroeconomically, the world was reeling from the 1974-1975 recession. The tanker market was beginning to collapse as the Suez Canal prepared to reopen in June 1975, which would render his Cape Route supertankers redundant and massively oversupplied. Onassis, however, was focused on a different kind of technicality: his last will and testament. Under the Greek Civil Code, specifically Article 1763, an individual had significant leeway in disposing of their estate, provided they met the forced heirship requirements for children. Onassis spent his final conscious weeks working with his lead counsel, Stelios Papadimitriou, to draft a 70-page document that was a legal masterpiece of exclusion. He intended to limit Jackie's inheritance to the absolute minimum required by their prenuptial agreement, funneling the bulk of his $500 million fortune, $358 billion today, into a trust, the Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation. The foundation was designed with a complex corporate structure, registered in Liechtenstein for tax neutrality, and governed by a board of life members. It was a technical immortality device. Half of his wealth was to be used for the foundation's operations, while the other half remained as the commercial capital for his shipping companies, with Christina as the sole heir to the business. This structure was intended to ensure that even if his family failed, his name would remain etched in the institutional fabric of Greece. He was obsessed with the logistics of his legacy, specifying the exact materials for the foundation's headquarters and the criteria for the Onassis Prizes, which he intended to rival the Nobel Prizes in prestige and monetary value, offering $100,000 in 1975 or $740,000 today. His physical decline was accelerated by a severe gallbladder infection in February 1975. His immune system, already compromised by the high doses of corticosteroids used to treat his myasthenia gravis, could not fight the sepsis. He was flown from Athens to the American Hospital of Paris on a specially equipped Olympic Airways Boeing 727. The flight was a logistical feat of airborne intensive care, featuring portable ventilators and a team of 6 specialists. The hospital suite in Paris was transformed into a command center with dedicated telex lines installed so his aides could continue to monitor the plummeting tanker rates while their employer lay in a coma. The room cost $2,000 a night, $1,480 today, a negligible expense for a man who was losing millions in market capitalization every hour he remained unconscious. As he lay in the sterile silence of the Paris hospital, the world he had built continued to rotate without him. Jacqueline was in New York, and Christina was in a state of nervous collapse in the next room. The Golden Greek was now just a collection of failing organs maintained by machines. He had spent his life engineering the flow of the world's most valuable commodity, but he was now experiencing the ultimate scarcity: time. The machines hummed with a rhythmic, mechanical indifference, a sound that echoed the engine rooms of the 6 ghost ships he had bought in Canada decades before. The cycle was ending where it began, with a man, a cold room, and the realization that the greatest empires are those that are built on the most fragile of foundations. On March 15, 1975, the life of Aristotle Onassis terminated in room 212 of the American Hospital of Paris, located in the affluent suburb of Neuilly-sur-Seine. The technical cause of death was bronchial pneumonia, a secondary complication of his long-standing myasthenia gravis and a failed cholecystectomy performed weeks prior. The clinical environment was a stark antithesis to the sun-drenched deck of the Christina O. He was tethered to a Bennett MA-1 respirator, a mechanical bellows that forced oxygen into his collapsing lungs at a calibrated rate. The man who had once manipulated the geopolitical flow of global energy was now unable to regulate his own respiratory rhythm. His body, which had survived the fires of Smyrna and the pressures of the U.S. Justice Department, had finally succumbed to the microscopic failure of its own neurotransmitters. The macroeconomic context of March 1975 was one of industrial mourning. The shipping industry was entering the Great Tanker Depression. The reopening of the Suez Canal, scheduled for June of that year, was already driving down the charter rates for the very supertankers that had made Onassis a billionaire. His death coincided with the obsolescence of his primary business model. While his accountants at Springfield Shipping Company calculated the potential losses from the impending surplus of ultra-large crude carriers, the hospital bill for his final stay reached $85,000, approximately $540,000 in 2026 purchasing power. He died possessing a net worth of roughly $500 million, $358 billion today. Yet he was surrounded by sterile white tiles and the rhythmic hiss of medical-grade gas. The behavior of the secondary characters in this final scene was a study in calculated optics. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was not present at the moment of expiration. She was in New York, having been assured by doctors that her husband's condition was stable. Upon receiving the news, she coordinated her return to Paris with a precision that bordered on the theatrical. She arrived for the funeral clad in a Valentino black silk ensemble, her face obscured by oversized sunglasses that had become her armor. Christina Onassis, the sole surviving heir, remained by the bed until the end. Her grief was documented in archival photographs as a raw, visceral collapse. The tension between the widow and the daughter was no longer a domestic friction. It was a legal standoff over the distribution of an empire. The logistical operation to return Onassis to Greek soil was a final display of his corporate reach. His body was embalmed using a high-index arterial fluid to withstand the transition from the Parisian winter to the Mediterranean humidity. He was placed in a 500-pound casket carved from rare African mahogany, lined with lead to ensure hermetic sealing, a technical requirement for international remains transport. A dedicated Olympic Airways Boeing 727-200 was stripped of its seating to accommodate the coffin. The flight from Orly to Athens cost the estate the equivalent of $120,000 in 2026 currency. When the plane touched down at Hellinikon, the same airport where his son had died 2 years earlier, the cycle of the Golden Greek reached its technical and emotional terminus. The funeral on the island of Skorpios was a restricted, somber affair. Only a handful of the world's elite were permitted on the island, which was patrolled by Greek police and Onassis's private security. He was buried in the small stone chapel he had built, placed in a crypt alongside Alexander. The white marble of the tomb, sourced from the quarries of Penteli, the same stone used for the Parthenon, bore a simple inscription. As the soil was shoveled onto the mahogany, the Christina O sat anchored in the harbor, its flags at half-mast, its engines cold for the first time in a decade. The man was gone, but the mountain of gold he had accumulated was about to trigger a decades-long war of attrition among those he left behind. The empire was now a leaderless leviathan, drifting into a world that no longer respected the old rules of the sea. The dissolution of the Onassis Empire began almost before the funeral flowers had withered on Skorpios. In 1975, the technical distribution of his $500 million fortune, $358 billion in 2026, was governed by his final Liechtenstein-registered testament. He had successfully outmaneuvered Jacqueline Kennedy. She was legally challenged on the validity of her $3 million prenuptial claim. After 2 years of aggressive litigation, Christina Onassis settled with Jackie for a lump sum of $26 million, equivalent to roughly $165 million today. In exchange, Jackie signed away all future claims to the Onassis name and estate. The Queen of Camelot returned to New York, her association with the Greek Tycoon ending as a profitable, if bruised, chapter in her biography. The remaining assets were split with mathematical coldness. One half established the Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, a technical immortality project designed to fund hospitals, schools, and cultural centers. The foundation's headquarters in Athens, a modernist structure of glass and steel, currently manages an endowment that has grown to exceed $1.5 billion in 2026 valuation. The other half went to Christina, who became the richest woman in the world at age 24. However, she lacked her father's metallurgical toughness. Her life became a series of 4 failed marriages and a tragic struggle with the Onassis disease, a profound systemic loneliness that no amount of liquid capital could cure. In 1988, she was found dead in a bathtub in Buenos Aires, the same city where her father had started his climb. The cause was a heart attack brought on by acute edema, mirroring the death of her mother, Tina. The ultimate fate of the Onassis physical asset serves as a terminal archive of the family's decline. The island of Scorpios, the sovereign rock where Ari had once hosted kings, became a fiscal burden for his granddaughter and sole heir, Athena Onassis. In 2013, Athena sold the island to Ekaterina Rybolovleva, daughter of Russian oligarch Dmitry Rybolovlev, for a price estimated at $150 million, approximately $230 million in 2026. The sale was a technical violation of Onassis's will, which stated that the island should remain in the family or be gifted to the Greek state, but legal loopholes involving long-term leases bypassed the restriction. Today, Scorpios is being transformed into a high-tech VIP resort, its olive groves replaced by helipads and luxury villas for a new generation of billionaires whose wealth is digital rather than industrial. The Christina O, the floating palace of the 1950s, underwent a $50 million restoration in the late 1990s, funded by a family friend, John Paul Papanikolaou. The technical overhaul replaced the aging steam turbines with MAN diesel engines and modernized the hull to meet current SOLAS, safety of life at sea standards. Today, the vessel that once hosted Churchill and Garbo is available for charter. For approximately $750,000 per week in 2026 currency, anyone with sufficient credit can drink at the whaleskin bar and dance on the Minoan mosaic pool. The yacht is a ghost ship of the jet-set era, a museum of a lost world where luxury was tactile and power was measured in the displacement of water. The Onassis name survives today primarily through the foundation, which operates the Onassis Cardiac Surgery Center in Athens, a facility that utilizes the highest grade of medical technology to save lives, the very thing Ari could not do for his son. The shipping fleet, once the largest private navy in history, has been absorbed into the anonymous structures of global logistics, its vessels now just nameless units in a digitized supply chain. The Golden Greek did not build a dynasty. He built a spectacular, self-consuming flame. His story remains the definitive technical manual on the acquisition of power and the simultaneous failure of the human heart to sustain it. Aristotle Onassis learned too late that the only thing a man of infinite possessions cannot buy is a place where the past cannot reach him.